Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Change on the Run podcast, where we discuss common change challenges and ways to address them when you're short of time. I'm your host, Phil Buckley. Today's topic is engaging leaders during change. Leaders have the greatest influence on the success of a change initiative, and without their full support, a project has little chance of succeeding. A leader's lack of visible commitment, reluctance to adopt new behaviors, or poor attendance at project review meetings will result in similar actions from their teams. Conversely, an aligned, energized, and fully supportive leader will motivate and galvanize their teams to adopt new ways of working and endure difficult transitions. So, how do you engage leaders during change to fulfill their roles and ensure people have everything they need to take on new mindsets, routines, and behaviors? My guest today is Tim Creasey. Tim, welcome to the show.
Hello, Phil. Glad to be here.
Thanks for being on. Tim is the Chief Innovation Officer of ProSci, a research-based change management certification, training, and consulting company featuring the ProSci ADKAR model. He holds an MBA from the Boston University and BA Economics and Political Science from Colorado State University. Tim is also the co-author of Change Management, the people side of change. So Tim, I'm really curious about what your experience has been in engaging leaders during change.
To build on part of your introduction, I think first we must begin by acknowledging that the most important contributor to successful change is the active and visible participation by our senior leaders. We've done over 2 decades of research here at ProSci, and every single time by a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 margin, when we ask about the top contributor to success, it is senior leaders stepping into this role of sponsoring change. And I make the point that sponsoring change is more than signing a check and signing a charter. It is an active role. It takes activities and actions, and it's not just a title, it's an active role in driving the outcomes of our most important change efforts. So the research tells us sponsors are critically important in times of change. My experience is that we find 2 kinds of leaders: those that view their role in supporting the outcomes of change through adoption and usage as something else, an additional line item to consider, something to put on the agenda at the end and boot off the agenda if you don't have time. Those leaders that have not seen that the human side of change is part and parcel to them achieving what they've set out to when they invest time and energy in an initiative. The other leaders are the ones that are great sponsors, the ones that have gotten to the point where they see that when they invest time and energy and political capital and financial capital in an initiative, and they expect outcomes from that initiative, that those outcomes are intrinsically tied to how well they help their people to bring the change to life in the way they show up, to engage, adopt, and use the change. That second camp of sponsors see change management as an enabler of what they have already set out to achieve, whereas the first ones have not really stepped into their responsibility and their role and how they will contribute to driving more successful outcomes of their most important initiatives. So I think those are kind of the 2 big camps: those that see this as something else, and those that have truly internalized that the people side of change is how we achieve outcomes of our most important efforts.
As you say, your research is conclusive over the expanse of the time that you've been doing it, many, many years. And I wonder, it does seem if there are 2 camps that they're diametrically opposed, and it can be a mindset, it could be a capability gap, it could even just be a sense of having greater, priorities. Where do you think it comes from when you do look at the 2 different ones? What are the biggest differences? Is it a mindset shift, or is it, I just don't know how to do it, so I'll ignore it? But what's been your experience?
Well, it's interesting. I actually turn the camera back at us a little bit as practitioners in terms of how we've gone about positioning change management with those senior leaders. And I think part of this goes to even the notion of the ROI of change management. Sometimes it's thought about as if it's something separate than the project. Like if you're thinking about a Venn diagram, you have two separate circles, the ROI of the project and the ROI of change management. And what we've been coaching practitioners for many years now is that no. The ROI of change management is capturing the people-dependent portion of the project's ROI. And so for many of those senior leaders, I really think it's more around an awareness of the need and a desire to participate and fulfill their role in sponsoring change. And that begins with context. Dave Elfenbaum was somebody I used to run into in these change conferences, and he tweeted one time. And so I reached out to him immediately to say, is that yours or somebody else's I need to attribute? Because it was so great. And it turns out it was his. So here was his tweet. He said, an ounce of context is worth a pound of isolated facts. And I think when we've tried to engage senior leaders about their role in sponsoring change, we've tended to bring a pound of isolated facts. Here's a communication plan. Here's a risk assessment. Here's stakeholder analysis. Here's resistance. Here's communication planning. Here's training planning. The way we need to begin our engagement with senior leaders around change is by creating that context, that ounce of context. And I think we started using what we call the key question. Senior leader, for your most important project, this one that we're talking about today, what percentage of this project's return depends on people changing how they do their jobs? And I think that establishes the context that leading change management as a discipline is a critical enabler of. It's an accelerant of the outcomes you've already signed up to deliver. It is that critical cog that sets between outputs and outcomes. It sets between designing to requirements and designing to results. It sets between delivering on specifications and truly delivering sustained improvement for the organization. And our senior leaders are signed up for the outcomes, for sustained value, for results. That's what they get paid to do. That's what we look to them to do. Our job, I think, is to then show them that crucial connection between what it is they've set out to achieve and this thoughtful discipline about how to support our people through the changes that we've asked them to take on. I've often also described this as sort of that shift in mindset from thinking about change management as an expense on the project to an investment in capturing expected results and outcomes. Because when we think about it as an expense, it's again, and change management gets LIFO'd all the time. Last on the budget, first off the budget. Last on the agenda, first off the agenda. And we do that when we think about it as just another discretionary expense of the project. Once we view the people side of change as an investment in capturing the intended outcomes, then I think we watch that shift start to happen, especially that mindset shift with our senior leaders. And that's the mindset piece. There certainly are leaders that struggle with the knowledge and ability about how to be a good sponsor too. And that will sometimes also result in some of this less than effective sponsorship we see.
Perhaps there's a difference between strategic and tactical support. And I've seen a lot of change practitioners, and it is more about, let me show you the plan. And it happens to be a very long one. And we've done diligence and here's our surveys, whatever. It's content, but it's not connecting to the objectives of what we're trying to achieve. And I think that miss sort of relegates it to be that line item that we can cut off quite quickly. Whereas even connections to technology and what's that's going to drive, I think our IT colleagues do a far better job of demonstrating the business case for taking on the technology and the software.
It reminds me of the Simon Sinek's golden circle, right? The whole start with why, and Sinek's notion that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And our tendency is to start at the what, then go into the how, and eventually maybe get to the why. But to build consensus and above and beyond buy-in to where people are actually invested in what we're asking them to do, we always have to anchor to the why, what it is we're trying to achieve. And that's where people-dependent return on investment and mitigating the costs and risks that are associated with leaving change up to chance, those become real bottom line impacts for the sponsor that's keeping them up at night or getting them up in the morning. What is it that they're apprehensive about and what are they motivated by? And it turns out supporting people through change aligns with both of those things in most cases. Our job as change practitioners is to really help them make that connection.
Do you think there's a challenge also with measurement too? Because again, measuring the benefits of the people side of change may be more challenging and definitely new to some of the leaders. What's been your experience there?
I actually gave a talk for ACMP NorCal a number of years ago called Courageously Committing to Outcomes. And I kind of built on this notion, Phil, that it's a lot easier to commit to activities than to outcomes. And there's a couple of different reasons, right? We have an affinity towards those activities. Did I send out the email? Did I show up and deliver the town hall? Did I cut the 3-minute video? Activities are binary. I either did them or didn't them. Outcomes tend to be much more gray across a spectrum. So that's one of the reasons. Accountability aversion is another reason I think we tend to steer towards activities over outcomes, because those cumulative outcomes tend to be a little bit trickier for us to figure out who's signing up to deliver them, again, because they are not necessarily entirely inside my control. Onerous ownership. You'll notice I like alliteration. So I actually had 5 different alliterations as to why committing out to outcomes was hard. Activity, affinity, accountability, aversion. Onerous ownership was the third. Who owns the outcomes? Especially in projects and initiatives, perhaps where the change is being initiated out of IT, but it's going to have an impact across the organization. Understanding who owns the baton of outcomes when it does get passed from the project into the organization can sometimes be messy. The calendar conundrum, I think, is the other one that I'd put out here.
Yes.
Right? Go live is on May the 4th, 2021. When are outcomes realized for the organization? June, July, August, next May, 3 Mays from now. And so go live is a date on the calendar I can put a star on, put a sticker on, put a stamp on my calendar on the wall. Outcomes happen at a much different time scale. And so getting more dialed into what the value continuum looks like for times of change, I think, is an important part of this. Something that we're actually elevating in a lot of the current work being done at ProSci within our methodology right now.
It is a great point about how do you sustain the change to realize the outcomes, and sort of generally the 80-20 rule. Perhaps 80% of the benefits could be a year down the road versus the 20 that you might see when you're providing sort of on support within that first couple of months. And I think there's also a challenge of the glittering prize syndrome, where leaders move to the next thing and they've got multiple objectives, multiple initiatives, and they're on to the next thing without making sure that we get those benefits from the ones that have just been completed. Any thoughts on doing that? How do you engage the leader or leadership team after it's been launched and you do have that transition into the business proper? Any thoughts there?
What we're doing is getting much more intentional about it. From the very beginning, we need to define what success actually means. How would we know if we got to the finish line? And that is a role of the leader, right? This is a leadership responsibility to define success. The change practitioner really has a role in extracting and packaging that definition of success to really help socialize the reason for change, build that compelling case for why the change is happening. But leaders must own defining the change. And I'll tell you what, we put out a change scorecard a number of years ago when I was working with a client. They were 2 years and $25 million into this project. And the very first cell of the change scorecard is what are the results and outcomes we're trying to achieve from this change. Figuring that they're 2 years and $25 million in, I click into that cell of the scorecard and said, okay, tell me what are the organizational benefits and the project objectives that we're actually driving toward. Then I kind of checked the mic and said, is this thing on? Did anybody, because it was silence in this room. And somebody pulled me aside, Phil, and they told me this. I thought this was brilliant. They said, here's the thing, Tim, someone somewhere at some point in time knew why we were taking on this project or this initiative. But that stuff evaporates over time. It was there when we initiated the change, but it evaporated. And so part of the role of the change practitioner and helping the sponsor stay in their role of sustaining outcomes is to continue to bring back that focus on success, the outcomes, the market improvement we set out to achieve when we launched this initiative. We do need to track progress along the way, and then we're being much more intentional in terms of the closeout, that there is a closeout period where the actions of bringing the change to life start to tail off, and we shift more into the actions of sustaining this change as business as usual, and being very clear on ownership, both of the design of the sustainment and execution of the sustainment, is a critical piece that was highlighted in some of our more recent research. This discussion highlights to me one of the big aspects of the change management profession, and I'd consider that time travel. Now, I'll build that out because when we talk about change, we describe it as a move out of a current state through a transition state to reach a future state. And we know that there's many of these simultaneously continuing continuously happening in the organization. So at the royal we level, it feels like slush where we never refreeze into a future state, but each initiative runs itself through either a sequential or iterative cycle of current, transition, future. Senior leaders live in the future state. That's where we pay leaders to live, is in the future state, to envision what we'll be as an organization 3 and 5 and 10 years from now. So you think about within a particular initiative or a project. Let's suppose it's going live on May the 4th. That senior leader's been thinking about this initiative for 2-3 years now. So they live in the future state. The project team lives in the transition state. We pay them to come up with the things we can move so that we are able to navigate from how things are done to a new way of doing things. So that's what we pay them to do, to spend their time in the transition state. The rest of the organization lives in the current state, how things are done today. So if that new change is being announced on May the 4th, your senior leaders may have been thinking about it for 3 years. Project team's been working on it for the last 12 months. Everybody else is finding out about it today. And so our job as change practitioners is to help those senior leaders connect back to the current state, to help the impacted employees understand why we even need to take a step out of how things are being done today. The ProSci research is abundantly clear that senior leaders are the preferred sender of change messages. Actually, in times of change, there's 2 preferred senders of change messages: the person I report to and the person at the top. The person I report to, I want to hear messages about how does this change impact me, our day-to-day work, our team. From the person at the top, I want to hear, why is this change happening? Why now? And what happens if we don't? And so that's this time traveling role that the practitioner has, because the senior leaders can get enamored with what will be, but to help our organization take a step out of how things are today and into this change state, the rest of the organization needs to understand why we are taking that step out of today. Vision fatigue is real, and it's something that our senior leaders unintentionally amplify when they continue to just pound the drum on what can be, instead of connecting back to their role and helping employees step out of what is today and step into whatever this initiative means in front of them.
I love the time machine of where are you at in that point. But there's something there about the reward mechanisms in the organizations too, that we tend to gravitate toward how we're rewarded. And it is very different from the senior leaders that are visioning out with the mandate. And the project team is, we just need to get it done well. And the people that are taking it on. Do you have any reflections on how you can leverage rewards to engage leaders potentially at all levels to do what they need to do to make change successful, to realize the outcomes?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, Phil, about rewards is that they're often tied to the achievement of something. And so to me, it's a step back to say, what is it that we are describing as achievement that warrants reward, right? And if we're defining success on a project by on time, on budget, meeting technical requirements, we've missed the mark, because we can give rewards for, and Daryl Conner is one of the great grandfathers of the discipline of change management. He used the language, the gap between installation and realization. This was a blog he wrote about a decade ago. But if we are considering the finish line as installing the change on time, on budget, meeting technical requirements, then we end up giving rewards for behavior that isn't actually getting us to the actual change we're trying to create for the organization. And so to me, I take one step back from the reward and say, how do we as an organization define success? Is it more of that technical on time, on budget, meeting requirements, or is it that we delivered the marked improvement we set out to on this initiative? And I actually think this is shifting. I think we are seeing quite a bit of a maturation in terms of how we describe and define success in organizations today. And I actually pay homage to a lot of the IT spend at the end of the 90s for why the discipline of change management emerged like it did. Because at the end of the 90s, we're all rolling fat in capital. We put a $20 million technological solution in, we get a 2% user uptake. And what do? Find the next $20 million technology to put in, right? And we were so enamored by the technology that 2% user uptake wasn't a problem because there was the next technology for us to install. I actually think leaders have started to redefine and redraw success more towards the outcomes we're trying to achieve than the outputs we're hoping to produce. And I think that's actually pulled the discipline of change management forward in a very unique way, because once you start caring about the finish line, the human side of change, you can't ignore it anymore. Because again, that's how we close the gap from, as Daryl describes, installing versus realizing value.
What I'm finding with some organizations, they are extending the timeline out a year and a half. People are following through a year down the road, which in the 90s or even 10 years ago, I didn't see that happening at all. Like once we're done, and we're not even going to do lessons learned because let's move on to the next one.
How quickly things are changing makes that a trickier commitment to the delivery of outcomes. But I do think it's a part of this extended strategic horizon that leaders are starting to bring to the table, especially in relation to change and how to deliver change outcomes.
And there's a great article that was posted yesterday on the Harvard Business Review, and it's called How Leaders Get in the Way of Organizational Change by Ron Carucci. And I'll just quote it for you. It says, when discussing a derailed transformation, he said that leaders frequently underestimate the amount of work required for the change, overestimate the organization's capacity to make the change, and misjudge how organizations view their connection to the change. Any reflections on engaging leaders to be realistic based on, fact-based evidence and your research?
Yeah, great question. And I think he actually highlights a couple of the different challenges here, right? He begins with leaders frequently underestimate the amount of work required for the change. And I think this comes as a result of leaders not appreciating the importance of adoption and usage and the role that it plays in delivering results and outcomes. I also think you can get a little bit of hubris here with a leader believing if they just tell people to change, then the change will happen. Despite how many times they've seen that not happen in their actual experience, we still fall maybe into that sort of approach as I will just tell them and therefore it will change. But I do think we're seeing that one change. I think there really is a bit of a renaissance around revaluing the human beings that make up organizations and how change impacts those people in particular. So I think we're seeing that one shift. Overestimating the organization's capacity to make the change is his second point, and I think he's probably spot on there. Our research suggests about 73% of our study participants are nearing at or past the point of change saturation, and saturation has costs and consequences. Like resistance, saturation is not free. It has impacts on individuals and how they show up. It has impacts on project performance and how our initiatives move forward. And there are organizational consequences of operating in a saturated environment. I think the challenge is that it's often only the front line that truly understands the cumulative and collective impact of the portfolio of change going on. And I, tell the story of that poor guy who comes in Monday morning, opens up his calendar and sees that he has training for project A on Monday morning. Projects B and C are double booked on Monday afternoon for a focus group and a new learning session. Projects D, E, and F are all, it is only at his calendar level that you see the collision actually occurring because senior leaders have more of that high level view of these initiatives and don't see how they run into one another. So I do think organizations, while there's been progress on project portfolio management, there's a huge opportunity to bring change portfolio management to the table so that we start to understand and manage based on that cumulative and collective impact of the portfolio of change. And then in terms of misjudging how the organization views their connection to the change, I think this is where senior leaders still struggle to make that connection to the fact that change happens one person at a time and that our organizational initiatives are only as successful as the individuals who have to bring a new way of showing up to life and how they show up. And so really helping to sort of close that gap, but then also help leaders understand that their active and visible role as a sponsor is what helps close the gap between the organization's view of the change and what we'd like it to be. So yeah, it's a reality that sponsorship is challenging. We are watching more and more leaders, I think, appreciate the importance of human beings in the organization and human beings in terms of their contribution to successful change outcomes. Because there's only so many times you can feign surprise that just because you told everybody to change, they didn't make the change. And then there's that point in time where you as a leader realize that your investment in being a sponsor of change is your investment in delivering the outcomes you promised to your board, to your people, to the other leaders in your organization. I think that's the kicker, is helping our leaders appreciate that change management is the tool that helps them achieve what they want to faster and more completely than they already thought they were going to.
We talk about engaging a leader through change so that they can fulfill their sponsorship role. But I'm also conscious that leadership teams act as a kind of cohesive unit, or you hope they do too. And part of them being successful is for them to be aligned with what the outcomes are and hopefully acting in unison to make them happen. Any thoughts about that, the role of alignment in engaging the leadership team or the steering committee as a unit to make sure that they fulfill their roles?
Yeah, that alignment is essential, especially as we have leaders in different parts of the organization trying to advance an initiative, because many of the initiatives we're implementing today are cross enterprise, right? I'm going to paraphrase Peter Senge. Essentially, what he said is that empowerment without alignment only amplifies the chaos. And I think this notion of a shared understanding of the finish line, the actual market improvement we're trying to get out of this initiative, is where we get that alignment. Once we are both looking at the same flag on the horizon, we can actually open up the opportunity for us to find creative ways to get to that flag on the horizon. If we're not charging at the same flag on the horizon, though, Phil, we can end up not only not getting there, but taking us in a completely different direction. And I'll often maintain, there's nothing more powerful than two people on the same page. There's nothing more distracting than two that are not. But there's nothing more devastating than two people that think they're on the same page, but are actually on different pages. That's when we end up both thinking we're doing good, hard work, and we end up taking ourselves farther apart. And so that definition of success, what are the actual organizational benefits we're trying to achieve and the project objectives? How are we going to know who's going to own them? To me, that alignment up front is how we create the kind of partnership and the collaboration we need across a team of leaders that are trying to bring forward real meaningful change into an organization.
Yeah, we talk a lot about gaps with leaders and that they're not as engaged as they could be. But I think on the other side of the coin, there's lots of great leaders who just demonstrate your vision of what a sponsor should do, and they're engaged and they do all the things that they need to do. And almost they're born with it or they practiced and they're doing great now. For the sponsors that are listening to our conversation right now, what are a few tips that you would say that would make them that admirable sponsor that will successfully lead change and get those outcomes?
Yeah, Phil, this is where the ProSci research has really helped us to demystify the notion of sponsorship. Because again, I think it can be a fuzzy, nebulous notion, especially if we've defined our role as signing checks and signing charters. The ProSci research gave us some real concrete roles of the sponsor: to be an active and visible participant throughout the life of the project. That means you don't just show up at the kickoff and the pizza party, but you are there to resolve obstacles, to remove barriers, to make decisions when they're necessary. And the ProSci research has, a dozen sub bullets of what that active and visible participation looks like. The B of the ABCs of sponsorship is to build and maintain a healthy coalition. You need to identify who are the other key leaders. Where are they in their change journey? Are they supportive or neutral or opposed? How do you build and maintain that coalition of support? And then the C's and the ABCs of sponsorship is to communicate directly to employees, that you, senior leader, are the face and voice of why this change is needed in the first place. You are the preferred sender of the messages that employees need to internalize so that they would have the awareness of the need for change and be ready to step into the change journey. So to me, it's really around getting clear and concrete around what those activities are. And this is where we tee up the relationship between the sponsor and the change practitioner, because most sponsors have the ability to fulfill these ABCs. In the midst of a particular project, they don't necessarily have the knowledge of what to do in this moment, in this situation.
In the spirit of change on the run, if you only had time to do one thing, that 80-20 action, let's say you've been flown in to help a leader to engage him or her and so that they could fulfill their role. What's the one thing that you would do that would give you the greatest results in the least amount of time?
I'd go back to asking them two questions. Question one is, for this project that you care the most about, what % of the expected value in return depends on people showing up in a new way? And I'll tell you, Phil, one of my biggest pet peeves in the world is when people use the word literally incorrectly. But if you want to watch a leader's gears literally start to turn, ask them the question: what % of this project's value depends on people showing up in a new way? And if it's a strategic or an important project, that answer is going to be 75, 80, 85, 90, 95%. And then I ask them the second question, Phil: what are you willing to do to increase the likelihood of capturing those people dependent results? Because what I want, Phil, is for them to sell themselves on the fact that for them to deliver what they signed up to deliver, they need to be thoughtful around how to support the adoption and usage of that solution. So those are the two questions I'd ask them, because I want them to solidify for in their own head that this is not just conceptually valuable to pay attention to the people side of change, but it is contextually valuable within this particular initiative, and that I will contractually engage as a leader to do what's necessary to actually sponsor the change.
Excellent questions. And I think part of the magic there too is that instead of telling the leader, based on research, this is what the answer should be, you're asking her or him what they think, because they are the ones that are leading and going forward, which I think is a beautiful engagement mechanism too. And just as we close off the show, do you have just an insight, a watch out, or a tip you'd like to share with our listeners?
I've been playing with a whole bunch of alignment hacks over the last year and a half, because as I mentioned, getting two people on the same page is one of those things that really intrigues me, and I think there's huge opportunity for. One of them is progress over perfection. So much easier said than done, especially for those of us who have perfectionist tendencies in us, but embrace, especially in today's environment with the extra permission that we've been given to lean into and experiment and change, embrace progress over perfection. And then my last tip is one that I think we all can embrace right now: everything in moderation except grace and gratitude. Those are the two we need to be overindulging like crazy in right now as we navigate these crazy times and help the people around us navigate the crazy times they have in front of them as well.
Beautifully said. Thanks so much for being on the Change on the Run podcast. I really appreciate you sharing your perspectives and all the guidance that you've shared over the last half an hour. So how can people get in contact with you?
Yeah, very good. If people want to learn about how we help others unlock the challenges of change, I'd encourage them to go to prosci.com, prosci.com. And if you want to find me in particular, I'm most active on LinkedIn. So you can track me down on my LinkedIn profile to find out how we are thinking about and helping people unlock the challenges of change.
Great. Thanks so much. I'll definitely have those in the show notes as well. Thanks so much for being on the podcast. And I'd like to also thank the listeners for listening. And if you'd like to get a new episode every 2 weeks, just hit subscribe and it will be there ready for you to go. And if you're interested in these topics, please check out the Change on the Run book and audiobook at your favorite bookseller. And until the next time, I wish you all the best as you continue to lead change.